This video will help you understand the major highlights for the Secure Act 2.0 that came out at the end of 2022, specifically for those prepping for retirement. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. On December 23 of 2022, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Secure Act 2.0 that it's colloquially being called. The technical name is the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. Colloquially, we're just calling it Secure Act 2.0. Now, this is a 4,000 plus page omnibus spending package that authorizes like 1.7 trillion in new spending. There's a couple of nuggets that come into this specifically for those prepping for retirement. And this kind of comes on the back of 3 years ago when the Secure Act was originally passed, and that had a whole host of changes, specifically those with required minimum distributions. I've got a previous video on those updates with required minimum distributions. Those all still stand, except there is one change for spouses. We'll jump into that later. Specifically, I thought we'd touch on, of the 4,000 plus pages, changes in required minimum distributions, changes in catch-up contributions, because there's some pretty unique stuff there. And then lastly, we'll touch on changes to Roth type accounts. So let's jump in. First up, required minimum distributions. So required minimum distributions, as you may know at this point, are forced liquidations you have to pull out of your pre-tax retirement accounts when you hit certain ages. Back in the day, it was when you turned 70 and a half, which is a little bit confusing. Then from the Secure Act, that RMD got pushed to age 72, which was nice for those who had not yet been pulling required minimum distributions. And now the Secure Act 2.0 comes on the back of, people living longer, etc. And they're allowing you to push out your required minimum distributions until age 75 if you were born in a specific year. So to touch on those specifics, if you were born in 1950 or earlier, your required minimum distribution age is age 72, or 70 and a half if you turned 70 and a half before 2020. For those of you born in 1951 to 1959, your required minimum distribution year is age 73. And then for those born 1960 or later, until things change, your required minimum distribution date is going to be age 75. So this isn't necessarily a blanket age 75 required minimum distribution update, but for anybody born 1960 or later, age 75 for now is what you can plan on. We'll touch on this again later, but the bill did add that there are no longer required minimum distributions for any Roth accounts. Now, there pretty much always has never been required minimum distributions out of Roth IRAs, but there has been required minimum distributions out of a Roth 401k, which is wonderfully confusing, I'm sure. To keep it simple, Roth 401ks had RMDs, Roth IRAs did not have RMDs, and in both situations, whenever you took money out, it'd be tax-free anyways. But specifically, this bill outlines that there are no longer going to be required minimum distributions out of Roth 401ks, which is nice because it simplifies things. No RMDs for Roth accounts. In addition, we did see a decrease in the penalty applied to missed required minimum distributions. In the event that you missed a required minimum distribution, let's say you inherited an account from somebody, or you just flat out forgot that you had required minimum distributions. Back in the day, there was a 50% penalty applied to those missed required minimum distributions. So let's say you had to pull out 20 grand from an account and you forgot to. Now you have to pull out 20 grand plus an additional 10 grand and stroke that check straight to the IRS. Those penalties have been reduced down to 25%, which is nice because it makes it a little bit less severe if you forget a required minimum distribution, but it's still real money. In addition, they said if you correct the mistake of the missed RMD in a relatively quick manner, that penalty can get reduced from 25% down to 10%. Now, anecdotally, I do have some experience where clients have essentially written like a my apologies letter to the IRS, pulled out the required minimum distribution that they missed, and there has been no penalty. But by the books, there's still a penalty. And they refer to that timely manner as a correction window, which there's some nuance there. We're not going to dive into it, but just know that there is some IRS guidelines as to what that window is to get your penalty reduced from 25% down to 10%. Now let's touch on the required minimum distribution updates for spouses who inherit IRAs. The Secure Act 2.0 adds an additional option for surviving spouses. Starting in 2024, the surviving spouse is allowed to use the decedent's expected RMD dates as opposed to their own to tax defer and delay pulling out required minimum distributions even longer. The surviving spouse would calculate those required minimum distributions using the uniform lifetime tables as opposed to the single lifetime tables. If unfortunately both spouses die before needing to pull out required minimum distributions, the second person in line to inherit this money would be treated as the surviving spouse, and that would allow them to stretch out required minimum distributions over their lifetime, rather than being stuck within that 10-year window of needing to pull out required minimum distributions. So next up, catch-up contributions. So catch-up contributions, historically, those were things when you achieved the age of 50 that the IRS would allow you to put more money into certain tax-qualified accounts. So back in 2023, typical like 401k contribution limit was $22,500. For IRAs, that was $6,500. And then once you hit the age of 50, in 401ks, you were allowed to put in an additional $7,500. And then in IRAs, you were allowed to put in an additional $1,000. Now, there was a special type of plan out there called a simple plan, and those simple plans had contribution limits of their own. Now, the IRA catch-up contribution of $1,000 has been fixed for the past 15 years. And then for 5 years before that, it was stuck at an additional $500. So not much has changed with IRAs. It's still a relatively small contribution limit compared to employer-sponsored retirement accounts like 401ks. Section 108 of the recently passed Secure Act 2.0 allows for automatic catch-up contribution increases to accumulate with inflation, and those will increase in $100 increments. So I'd say be prepared to start seeing those catch-up contributions start to index for inflation rather than be stagnant for another 15 years. Now, touching on employer plans where the bulk of your savings might be, relative to employer plans, Section 109 says effectively in 2025, those catch-up contributions that we're all used to, which do increase pretty much with inflation in employer plans, which would be that $7,500 we talked about earlier, those will continue to grow, but there's going to be an additional catch-up contribution for those between the ages of 60 and 63. The literature says between the ages of 60 and 63, you'll be allowed to put in an additional $10,000 or 150% of whatever the catch-up contribution limit is for most of the folks over the age of 50, whichever one is greater. So for example, let's say in the future, let's say it's the year 2025, and in 2024, the catch-up contribution limit on 401ks was $7,500. 150% of $7,500 is $11,250. That $11,250 is higher than 10 grand, which means since you're allowed to contribute the higher of the two between the ages of 60 and 63, your contribution catch-up limit will be limited to $11,250, which is great news for those of you who are maybe behind in your retirement and you've come into higher incomes in your latter working years. This could be a great opportunity to essentially catch up big time on missed retirement savings previously. Now, there's some nuance there because that $10,000 limit is going to be indexed for inflation starting in 2026. We also don't know what the catch-up contributions are going to be in 2024. We know what they are in 2023, but we don't know 2024. So just be mindful that you do have some options, and between the ages of 60 and 63 is kind of prime time to really juice up your savings if you're a little bit behind. Now, I'll touch on simple plans for a little bit. I really don't see them very often, but nonetheless, those aren't going to be 10 grand and 150%. It's going to be 5 grand and 150%. Just know that there's a little bit of nuance when it comes to simple plans. Lastly, let's touch on Roth updates. So there's been updates for Roth tax type accounts. We touched on this earlier, but there is going to be the elimination of Roth required minimum distributions out of employer plans like 401ks, 403bs, 457 plans. And that's going to start in 2024. Specifically, that's Section 325 of the bill if you want to go check that out. Also in Section 601, there was granted the ability to set up SEP or simple Roth accounts. So for those of you who are self-employed or you run a small business and maybe you've set up like a SEP IRA or a simple plan, you are allowed to now put in Roth SEP or Roth simple money into those plans, which is great news, especially if you're self-employed and you're looking for tax-deferred places to save, but you don't necessarily want to take a tax deduction. In addition, one of the coolest things out of this is that employers are allowed to make Roth matching contributions on a discretionary basis. I don't know how that's going to work out specifically with your companies. However, you'll probably start seeing, hey, we match X percent and we match that in a Roth fashion. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows because the match would still be considered taxable income to you. Just like if you were to save money into a Roth account, you still have to consider it taxable income and then go save it after tax. But nonetheless, it's an option for an employer who maybe wants to sweeten the pot and say, hey, we'll automatically contribute this to your 401k. You will have to pay taxes, but nonetheless, it's free money into your account. One thing specifically to be aware of for maybe my higher income earning folks, which the IRS defines as 145 grand, Section 603 says that if you're a high wage earner, if the company is going to allow you to make catch-up contributions, you must only use Roth catch-up contributions to do that. So if your gross income is above 145 grand, something to look at when you're making your catch-up contributions, if you're over the age of 50, is making sure that those catch-up contributions solely are going into the Roth account. I'm sure that the third-party administrator that manages the 401k will have some way of ensuring you don't mess this up. But do know that if your company does not have a Roth option in your 401k or 403b, you will not be allowed to make catch-up contributions if you make above 145 grand. So be prepared for some signatures on some updated 401k plans this year as people try to catch up with this new legislation. One last thing relative to Roth IRAs, we'll have to touch on this more another time, but the Secure Act 2.0 did permit, starting in 2024, the ability to move 529 money into a Roth IRA. Now, it's not perfectly simple, like you can move $1 million from 529 to Roth IRA. There are some limits. In particular, some of those limits are saying your beneficiary on the 529 plan, that must be the account owner of the Roth IRA. So if you've got Junior listed as the beneficiary on your 529 plan, Junior has to be the account owner of the Roth IRA you move the money to. That 529 plan must also exist for 15 years, so probably not something you're going to be able to do immediately unless you've had a 529 open for 15 years. And then the previous 5 years of contributions and earnings inside that 529 plan are not going to be eligible to move to a Roth IRA. And again, even if you had a $1 million 529 plan, the limit on how much you can move from 529 to Roth IRA is going to be limited at the IRA contribution limit for that year. So if we use 2023's numbers for $6,500, you'd have to piecemeal your entire 529 balance every year at $6,500 increments, right? Barring any increases in that limit. And further nuance, that contribution, that transfer limit is going to be decreased if Junior makes any of his own traditional IRA or Roth IRA contributions. Essentially, there's no double dipping. You can't have Junior fund a Roth IRA and then also send over $6,500. And the biggest limiter here is no matter how long you plan to do this for, the maximum amount that can be moved from a 529 plan to a Roth IRA over a lifetime is 35 grand. So maybe it's not the most optimal strategy in the world. However, if you do have money inside of a 529 plan that Junior isn't going to be using for college, you might as well find a way to piecemeal that over into a Roth IRA. That money grows tax-free. There's also some abilities to take out money in the future, cost basis tax-free first. There's also some abilities to take distributions out of the Roth IRA for further purposes. So maybe there's some good financial planning opportunities there. So if you've got kiddos, but you set up a 529 plan for them thinking they were going to go get their doctorate and they ended up going to junior college for a couple years and then they're off in the workforce, and you've got some large 529 plan that's just growing and manifesting, it might make sense to start looking into doing some 529 to Roth IRA transfers. So calls to action here. If your spouse has an IRA and you're listed as the primary beneficiary, it would behoove you to be aware of the required minimum distribution options for you as the surviving spouse. Number two, if you're short on your retirement savings and you're looking ahead, catch-up contributions are probably going to be helpful. It would also behoove you to be aware of those options when you turn age 50, and then your options when you're between the ages of 60 and 63 if you want to severely catch up on, previously missed retirement saving opportunities. So third call to action, if you make over 145 grand and you're approaching age 50 or you're past the age of 50, you're gonna wanna be aware of the nuance that goes into catch-up contributions needing to be into a Roth fashion. And essentially inside baseball, the IRS is trying to collect tax revenue from people. So obviously they're gonna encourage more Roth contributions because that means they get the money today. The last thing I would say as we prepare to wrap up, all of these cool nuanced financial planning things are essentially window dressing unless the fundamentals of your financial plan are being met. So emergency funds, saving X% of your income to reach your goals, these nuanced Roth versus pre-tax versus high income catch-up, etc., all that goes out the window if we're not meeting the fundamentals. So let's make sure we have the fundamentals in force, and then we've got some nuance here to be aware of on top of that. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any further questions, drop them in the chat below, send me an email, we'll get you squared away. Hope you have an awesome rest of the week and a great start to 2023. Talk to you later. Bye.